Welcome to the glorious last panel of the Helsinki Security Forum this year. And the title of the panel is European Security in Global Competition. And all the words, of course, mean something in the sentence. Security has a meaning referring to plurality and pluralization, fragmentation, and surviving in the more fragmented world. That's the most traditional meaning of security. And then Europe, what does that mean in this context? Are there different Europes emerging? Are we seeing the same process of fragmentation happening? Should we talk about Europe in the wider sense of the word, or in a more constricted sense of the word? And what are the key institutions of Europe? Is it the team sport? Competition refers to excelling, demonstrating one's supremacy in a particular field. It's a competition, there's rules in it, there's an audience viewing it. So what is the audience in here? We have been discussing the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Usually the audience seems to be the global south, kind of a monolithic understanding of the global community. So what are the rules? Or are we only seeing paths in front of us, different tracks? Some are better trodden than others, some might be emerging, and perhaps there are also glimmers of hope that we should be looking for. Is it a love in ruins, kind of a feeling that things are collapsing, disintegrating, Europe is losing its position on a map? There might be lofty words about Europe, as is usual, stated from podiums of different type. But actually, are we seeing the regression of Europe, losing its global position, and the emergence of actual unitary state actors like China, US, whereas the Europeans on the whole are in decline? So key questions, how we will be winning the game, how we might be losing the game. And we have excellent panelists here today. Pekka Haavisto, Foreign Minister for Finland. Pekka's career is a long one. All the Finns know him very, very well. But one point is that he has been always a keen supporter of knowledge-based decision-making. And to prove that, he stayed at FIIA during his career for 1 year. And I heard he was specializing on Russia and a comprehensive security. So welcome, Pekka.
Thank you.
Then we have Helga Schmid, Secretary General of OSCE, a very important organization for Finns. During the past 3 years, I have been working quite a lot with the theme of Helsinki spirit. That spirit seems to now be blown away by the much colder spirits that are causing the freezing of many practices that we used to have, that we used to cherish quite a lot. So welcome as well. And then we have Jutta Urpilainen, Commissioner in charge of international partnerships. It's a pleasure to have you here. I remember when I visited you last spring in Brussels, and we talked quite a lot about the momentum, the democratic momentum in Europe. There was a keen sense that Europeans are now understanding very clearly the mission and the vision that needs to be done in helping Ukraine. But there was also a sense of worry how that momentum will survive, that some internal frictions in Europe might come about, and then perhaps certain constraints when it comes to helping of Ukraine? That are we going beyond those constraints? So quite a lot of worries were there at the moment of solidarity, and that is an interesting mix of emotions. Solidarity, the momentum of that, and then worry, will it sustain itself? Okay, Pekka, I will yield the floor first to you for an opening statement on the theme.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. And I think early Sunday morning it's difficult to give a comprehensive analysis, so this will be only fragments that I'm giving to you. First of all, I spent yesterday a good day at Tampere, a very important Finnish city, and actually we had a discussion with Ukrainian artists about the culture as a weapon and information as a weapon, and it was one of the most interesting discussions because there were musicians and some artists and who explained how art and information is used currently in Ukraine as part of their fight for the independence and sovereignty, and how much they can spread the word also around the world through the culture. And then in the evening I was in the Tampere Workers' Theatre, where there was an excellent piece of Momentum 1900, which was about the Paris World Exhibition 1900, where there was a Finnish pavilion, and there were stories that I didn't know, for example, that all the material was sent through St. Petersburg to the pavilion, and Russians were capturing some of the pieces of art and some of the tools and so forth, so making a lot of harassment for the preparation of this pavilion. But as all Finns know, that was a successful thing, and it was something like an important step of our independence fight. And somehow the whole day at Tampere was about the culture and how to use culture in this kind of fights, and that triggered, at least in me, a lot of thoughts. Also because I'm following, or try to follow quite closely, what the opposition is currently doing in Russia, and how some of the artists and some of those vocal people, like Alla Pugacheva, well, in my office all the younger generation asks who is Alla Pugacheva, but DDT, Yuri Savchuk and others who are as part of the cultural front in Russia, but raising their voices in this situation, and I think we shouldn't undermine that role. Then actually my second thought or second fragment is about the unity of the like-minded countries. I had an excellent visit to Japan after the United Nations General Assembly, and had the opportunity to discuss with Japanese, who were very impressed, first of all, about the invitation that they got to the NATO Madrid summit and other with other Asian Pacific countries, like-minded countries, and somehow feeling this even wider front that what NATO represents currently, or what the European institutions represent currently. And I think that's a path that we should follow, finding more maybe institutional arrangements with the like-minded countries, even globally, and think about those steps. This leads me to actually another meeting that we had in Helsinki with our African colleagues, and I'm sure Jutta has been facing these issues from the commissioner's point of view. We had in June here in Finland 20 African foreign ministers together with the Nordic ministers, and we discussed, of course, about the solidarity towards Ukraine, and we could see and feel that there were many countries which we call like-minded African countries, where the ministers and the countries are sitting on the fence on the Ukraine issue, waiting what will be the solution and not taking any stand. And I have to say that we pressured quite strongly some of our colleagues, saying that when there was apartheid in South Africa, we didn't stay silent. When there was the fight against the colonialism in Africa, we didn't stay silent. Now you are staying silent when the major principles of the UN Charter are violated, major principles of international security are violated. What if somebody says on your continent that let's return to the borders of the 1920s, or if somebody said on your continent that let's arrange referendums, where are the borders, and then follow those referendums? That would be a chaotic situation. And I think this is still the message and discussion that we have to we have to strengthen and the message that we have to strengthen from our side. There may be a couple of last fragments. We have a multitude of challenges, and this is very difficult to describe what are our key challenges in the current situation, because we have a traditional security challenges. We have the really traditional war ongoing in Europe. Then we have another layer, which is the nuclear layer currently there. I have to say that we, in the foreign ministry, when we have tried to catch our nuclear experts, we noticed that almost all of them are retired, because the nuclear issue was the topic during the 60s and 70s, very much in the security debate. What are the nuclear strategies? What can happen, and so forth. But all this thinking has not been active for years, of course, because there hasn't been this kind of threat present, and we really have to come back. And even to the interesting question that which I asked myself, is the first use of nuclear, is it banned internationally? Is it a legal issue? Are there agreements on this issue and others? And this is a very, very interesting topic, and we have to come back to those issues. And at the same time, we have other global threats. We have the climate, of course, climate issue staying there. We have now the food crisis issue, caused also triggered by the Russian aggression against Ukraine and so forth. And all these layers we have to face and also explain to people what this means, what our resilience means in all these different contexts, which is a huge challenge also in a public debate in Finland. And then finally, my last fragment is actually about Russia. I know that you have been discussing this topic the whole morning, but we have at least two schools in Finland. We have those who say that, and now I'm speaking of the public debate, who say that Russia is always the same. Russia has always been the same. Russia never changes. And then we have another school, which probably I'm a little bit closer, that Russia changes all the time. That when we look 100 years backwards, the Tsar time, the Lenin time, Stalin time, Khrushchev time, Brezhnev time, Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, we have, so to say, permanent change. Is it a change towards better or worse? That's a topic to be debated, but we are living next to the country that changes all the time. And how we can influence to that is very, very key issue for the European politics and so forth. I will stop here. Thank you.
Pekka, thank you very much. And on the topic of fragments, war is a great vortex, and it engulfs many issues and topics, and it fragments those. It fragments interests as well. People see contradictory interests. I suppose in Global South, you don't have to go very far away already. The vortex of the war causes interest to split, and even though there might be like-mindedness, after a while, those like-minded elements might be disappearing because there's split of interests. What do you think are the fragments that we should hold dear? What are the kind of the glimmers of hope right now? What you would not let go, for example, when it comes to elements of dialogue?
I will actually, and we have here now people representing those institutions that are so important for us, but I'm always thinking that if we let the institutions go, then we have a problem, because to establishing institutions, as we know, always in the international politics is always a long process. And whatever we do, we can freeze memberships, we can do those, but we shouldn't let the institutions go. And then I'm speaking about, of course, how important European Union has been here, actually having taking the first fight. Actually, somebody said that European Union is at the front seat and NATO is at the back seat on this solidarity towards Ukraine. We have seen European Union during this crisis actually finding its soul again. It's always said that Europe is good at crisis, and I think this has been really underlining that. And then, of course, when Helga is talking about the perspective of the OSCE, I think that's a very important. We are looking, of course, the 2025 chairpersonship from Finland. It's very interesting chairpersonship, of course, in these circumstances. There are actually, I want to say also one issue, how much we have to understand other people's history. I stayed a long time, you understand why, with my Hungarian colleague Peter Siarto when we discussed when and how the Finnish NATO ratification will happen in Budapest, and he asked us calm down and process is ongoing, we hope that, and so forth. But then he said that Hungary has this experience of being left alone. And I asked, what do you mean? And he said, don't you remember 1956? We were left alone. And I said, well, I wasn't born 1956, but I have seen some news clips from that time when people were collecting money at the streets of Helsinki to support Hungary at that moment when the Russians attacked the Hungarian revolution, or how you want to, uprisal of the people and so forth. But he said, no, what our overall experience, we have been always left alone, and our policy is based on that kind of thinking. We have to understand also the close history of some of our neighbors, and I think all this dialogue is important for us to understand where Europe is going to.
Yes, yesterday we were discussing Arctic Council, and there was the fear that the freezing cannot last forever, but the war, we don't know the length of it. So what happens then on the meanwhile in the institutions? Are they developing to a new direction when Russia is not taking part actively, and the other countries are actively engaging in the topics that perhaps are not to the Russian liking?
Well, of course, that can happen, that if it's Arctic Council -1, if it's Arctic 7 instead of Arctic 8, it's difficult to return if things are moving. And I have to say that I regret one issue, and now I'm referring to the big environmental threats. I was sitting 21 spring in Reykjavik in May with the 8 Arctic ministers. Mr. Blinken was there and Mr. Lavrov was there, and it was like a kitchen table discussion about the Arctic issues and about the environmental issues. And then we heard from Lavrov how seriously Russia is taking now the climate issues, because the Arctic pipelines are collapsing, because the permafrost is melting in Siberia and in the northern areas. And that finally, also the scientists are now agreeing that climate change exists. I said, we all congratulated Lavrov for that. Well, this is great. And then he started to speak about the lifting up the nuclear waste around Novaya Zemlya. And I said, wow, I have been following the environmental movement in Russia, which has asked this from 70s, 80s, 90s, fighting for the issue that finally something should be done for this stupid issue that there are nuclear waste is dumped around Novaya Zemlya. And then, of course, he said that there's international cooperation needed for that and so forth. And this is, of course, the situation where we cannot go on any of this cooperation, unfortunately.
Helga, you represent perhaps the widest element of political friendship in Europe. How do you see these issues of fragmentation, freezing, but also how that organization now represents Europe? And if the great power competition is going to continue, what type of pressures, gravitational pulls there are going to be for OSCE in the future?
No, thanks very much. And first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's always nice to be in Helsinki. And let me start by saying the OSCE is more than Europe. The OSCE is 57 participating states. It's North America, it's all of Central Asia, South Caucasus, and all of Europe, including Southeastern Europe, the Balkans. And that's very significant. And we're not the EU, we're not NATO, we're not like-minded states. We were born actually in the Cold War. I think this is very significant, because I would like to underline what Pekka said, and I agree entirely with the points made before. But before I come to that, and also the importance of dialogue, just let me say, because sometimes you hear, but you are an organization that is supposed to do conflict prevention. So what did you do? Why could you not prevent the war? Is this a failure of multilateralism? And to this, I would say clearly, no, it's not. It's not because commitments, key principles are being violated, that the principles are wrong, or the principles need to be changed. It's one participating state that has violated basically all of the Helsinki principles, the same principles that came into life here in Helsinki almost 50 years ago. The principles of the inviolability of borders, sovereignty of states, integrity of states, the need to for peaceful settlement of conflicts. And in the OSCE, we also offered an alternative, like there was the bilateral track with the US, there was the track with NATO. Our chair, the current Polish foreign minister, came to Vienna early February to launch the renewed European security dialogue. And this was really an offer to everyone to put differences aside, to sit around the table and address all the issues of grievances, divergences. Unfortunately, Russia chose force over dialogue. So this is the situation we are facing. Now, what does it mean for the OSCE? It means, first of all, we will continue to support Ukraine. I actually had the pleasure this week to sign with the Deputy Foreign Minister of Ukraine, who came to Vienna, an exchange of letters, which allows the OSCE to continue the good work we have been doing in this country for almost 30 years. And at this point, this is very much looking into protection from landmines, which is a huge issue, or also because wars are never gender blind. They particularly affect women, children. There is the issue of sexual violence, trafficking in human beings. So we're working on this as an organization. We're also responding to the environmental damages that are caused by war. Or another issue is the illicit trafficking of weapons and ammunition. So a lot of focus is on Ukraine. But I also would want to pick up what Pekka said. Security in Europe depends also very much on the security around us. And here I would like to mention Afghanistan. It should not be forgotten, because the takeover of the Taliban actually meant an increase, is a particular plight again for the women and girls. But it also means increased drug trafficking, increased trafficking of arms, extremism. And this is why for the OSCE, it means so we need to support in particular Central Asia to cope with border security. We're doing that also with support of the European Union. Thank you, European Union, to ensure more resilient border communities. And we also, because also the Central Asian countries are particularly exposed to the economic impact of this war. Many countries depend on remittances from the guest workers. This is all fading away. I won't go into the work we do elsewhere, South Caucasus, Western Balkans. We have elections today in Bosnia. We're monitoring them. ODIHR is monitoring them. But security also goes, of course, beyond regional conflicts. And climate change was mentioned. For me, this really is one of the key challenges, also security challenges of the 21st century. And actually, the Helsinki Final Act is a very wise document, because it already mentions climate change and the need for participating states to focus on that. And here the added value we bring as an organization is that we bring countries together, for example, because many countries share natural resources, and climate change doesn't stop at the border. So we bring countries to do joint analysis, but then also to come forward with common solutions when it comes to climate adaptation, mitigation. For example, the Shar Mountains that are shared between Kosovo, Albania, and North Macedonia, or we are promoting cross-border wildfire management in the South Caucasus. I don't have to say much more to say how of course, important, but also sensitive that is. Maybe, I don't want to belong two or three, maybe two more points very quickly. What's very important for me is, and this is also a commitment for the OSCEs, this is artificial intelligence, new technologies. I think it's crucial to embed accountability, but also gender equality, non-discrimination in technical development. And here cyber is another critical topic of our times because conflicts have become more hybrid and cyber measures are increasingly used before or alongside military aggression. And here cooperation is actually one of the rare islands or cyber diplomacy is one of the rare islands of cooperation within the OSCE also, because we have very concrete tools to avoid unintended conflicts that actually might stem from the use of information and communication technologies. We're very much looking forward to 2025 when Finland will take over. Also because Finland has always been a promoter of an issue that is very dear to my heart, and I also know Jutta's heart, and that's the fact that you will never achieve sustainable security if you do not promote women's economic empowerment, women's empowerment in general, because sometimes women are viewed as victims, and it's very important we address the issues of gender-based violence that have gone up big time during COVID also, but we need to do more to make sure that women are part of the solution, and youth. This is our commitment in the OSCE. We work a lot with youth, also on some of the challenges I've been referring to, like climate change. And here I know I will have a huge supporter in the upcoming Finnish chairpersonship. Thank you.
Thank you for that. A lot has happened during the past year, and OSCE has been at the center of quite many events, episodes of what we have been seeing. What feeling of loss you have in your mind? Is there nostalgia for something that is gone, and perhaps you are fearing is gone for many years to come?
I wouldn't talk about nostalgia. I mean, the problem we have always been facing is the need for consensus. Now, consensus-based solutions are powerful ones because they're really everyone agrees to that, but it can be a problem. And the problems we have had is before the 24th of February, like our budget very often is taken hostage by political considerations, so consensus is being misused. But I would say actually multilateral organizations, and in particular the OSCE, play an ever more important role now, because while indeed we are, I think everyone is trying, the EU, everyone is supporting Ukraine. We were, for example, the first organization to address the issue of accountability, because truth is always the first casualty in war. And we were the first organization to, early March already, to launch the Moscow mechanism, which allows experts to go on the ground and really understand what's really happening. So it's a very active role the OSCE is playing. Dialogue needs to remain. I mentioned some of the issues why this is important. And also dialogue is sometimes equal to being soft or not standing up for the principles. I think that is wrong. I think we have been very clear, the chair has been very clear, I have been very clear, Secretary General of this organization, that this is an unprovoked and unjustified war. At the same time, dialogue channels need to be kept open. And like the OSCE, for example, was the first responder in 2014 when the special monitoring mission was set up. And again, thank you to Finland for supporting this with not only financial support, but also with very excellent personnel and experts through the years. The OSCE will play a role sooner or later. And I haven't even mentioned the issue of arms control, and where also Finland, for example, is currently chairing the structured dialogue, which we have all the tools that are necessary, and when the time comes, we are ready to deploy them. So I would say it's actually a quite active moment for us.
Yes, when I discuss with people who are from OSCE, it is very common to hear the phrase that dialogue is essential even when there is no solution in sight. But are there moments when dialogue itself can be used for power political purposes, that it is power politics by other means, where dialogue is not so hopeful that it is actually a means to an end? How do you see this side of dialogue that perhaps is not as pleasant as we would like it to be?
Well, again, the OSCE is not only about dialogue. I think the OSCE provides a platform for 57. At this point, the focus is very much also on documentation. It's a forum for documentation. I mentioned the Moscow mechanism that was launched. No other international organization has been able to do that. Every Thursday, we have a permanent council. And the first item on the agenda, as proposed by our current chair, is always Russia's aggression against Ukraine. So this allows really participating states to voice their clear stance. At the same time, a lot of concrete work is being done. This is why I mentioned the projects we are currently pursuing in support of Ukraine, but also the projects that continue in all the other countries, because there is a huge impact on other countries, and the field missions the OSCE has, but also in, for example, in Central Asia, in Southeast Europe, allow us to do very, very concrete work, which is absolutely essential for the people.
Thank you. Jutta, Pekka already referred to one of the key concepts in European Union, and that is emergencies as opportunities. So do you see through your tears possibilities?
Thank you, Mika, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation and congratulations for the organizers for this great event. As Pekka and also Helga already underlined, of course, our eyes are now on Ukraine. And Russia's attack on Ukraine needs to be countered and also responded. And the unity of the EU has been found in this crisis, like Pekka very well explained. So Team Europe is actually supporting Ukraine in its fight on 4 fronts. Firstly, we are supporting Ukraine with weapons, humanitarian and financial assistance. Secondly, we are impeding Russia's ability to finance its war through sanctions. And thirdly, we are responding to the economic fallout and energy crisis in Europe. And fourthly, which is under my responsibility, we are helping our global partners in food and energy crisis. And it needs to be said that Finland has been fully engaged in this firm European response. And the line of the Finnish government has been very clear, and I thank for that and also congratulate for that. But when I was preparing my opening statement, or actually my thoughts, what I would like to say here, I thought that our topic actually is a bit broader. So we should be looking at the 21st century, at global competition, as well as the role of Europe. And I would like to bring a few aspects to this discussion based on my previous experiences in the UNGA, but also G20 and some EU meetings. And these 3 aspects are the following. So first, we should ask ourselves if the war in Ukraine is only a step in a broader hybrid operation launched against the West. Secondly, we should also analyze how the war in Ukraine might fit to future plans in Sino-Russian partnership. And thirdly, I think we should continue our work on resilience and strategic autonomy of the EU and our partners. So on the first question, I would actually like to draw us to the mood in the UN General Assembly in September. Of course, Ukraine was the topic, but the global consequences of the war were in focus. So energy crisis, food crisis, economic recession, implications on trade and transport. And one hot item, actually, in my discussions, I don't know, Pekka, if you can share this, was the question of fertilizers, on which actually Europe was challenged by Africa. And in a working session led by President Macron, I was able to explain to the African presidents and also African leaders, but also leaders of the UN bodies, how EU sanctions do not cover Russian agricultural products or fertilizers. But there are also other narratives told. So we are definitely challenged. There is a battle of narratives ongoing. In the global south, Russia wants to be seen as another victim of the Western colonialism, as the one that really dares to challenge the US-led world order. So Russia has objectives in Ukraine, but clearly Russia also has a plan with global objectives. And I would like to describe it as Russia's global hybrid operation against West. President Macron has called it even a global hybrid war, but we all hope, of course, that Russia's operation does not escalate the warlike action globally. On the second question, I would like to start from my experiences in G20, such as the latest development ministers meeting in September. And in this platform, connecting the major economies of the North and the South, it is interesting to see how China and Russia support each other. As an example, the US effort to really isolate Russia from G20 was completely opposed by China. In understanding global consequences of the war in Ukraine, we cannot turn a blind eye on China's effort to benefit from this situation. So we should follow closely ramifications of Beijing's no limits partnership with Moscow. And geopolitical rivalry between the US and China may define 21st century. It will be a strategic battle for power in economy, in technology, in military, as well as the system of government. This global competition is the context also for Russia's action. So the war in Ukraine has consequences which might be beneficial to the future plans of various states planning to challenge the West. In addition to China, I think we need to look at the members of Shanghai Cooperation Organization and also BRICS. The role of the EU is to be discussed in this wider context. So having followed closely the work of the European Commission, now 3 years, I have experienced that the EU is serious, I would say very serious, in preserving its strategic autonomy. So steps have been really taken in stronger defense, but also in energy security and in technological sovereignty. And this work on strategic autonomy has a strong Franco-German support, also based on the recent speeches of Scholz and Macron. So we need to develop strategic autonomy also in Africa, where Sino-Russian influence is very, very active and true. So that's why the EU is really committed to develop the Euro-African renewed partnership. For Africa, Europe, 27 member states and the Commission, we are still the biggest investor, the biggest trade partner, and the biggest aid donor. But more work, of course, needs to be done. As we all know, China has been inviting the Global South to its Belt and Road Initiative. And it has definitely created serious dependencies, especially in Africa. So in order to avoid those very toxic dependencies, the EU and the US have developed our own infrastructure initiatives. The EU has invited the Global South to the Global Gateway. It's a 300 billion euros infrastructure investment plan, which I introduced in December. And now we are actually aiming at this moment at the EU-US summit on this topic, as introduced by President von der Leyen in her State of the Union speech in the beginning of September. So these remarks reflect the reality in which our geopolitical commission is navigating in the global competition. But I have to say that it's not only a competition, it is also cooperation. And as EU and as Europe, we continue to be a champion of renewed multilateralism, so maintaining resilient, rule-based international order is the major challenge for multilateralism. And we are by far the largest contributors to the UN. And as a bridge builder, the EU should try to avoid escalation of bipolar development. And as democracies, we are natural allies with the US, but the EU should build on its own international partnerships of equals based on joint priorities. And the EU must keep its autonomy in its relationship with China. This is my opinion. Frank dialogue also with bears and dragons, not only with the like-minded. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you were clearly correct when you were saying that Russia has this campaign, that its information warfare is also effective. It is putting itself into the position of a champion, anti-colonial champion, and of course Europe has quite a lot of legacies when it comes to the colonial times, and there's a lot of bitterness in the global south when it comes to Europe's history. And Russia, of course, has similar type of legacies when it comes to Eastern Europe. The imperialism and colonialism that we are seeing in today's Ukraine, that's Russian form of that, but somehow it is making itself look very pure in the eyes of certain global publics. So what are the good ways of resisting that? You mentioned infrastructure investments. But should we have a narrative that is clear and a vision that is as clear as Putin's attractive narrative? And what that vision or narrative should be?
I think actually we have a narrative, and of course we try to also explain that narrative in our partner countries. But I think, I don't know how, Pekka, you felt that atmosphere in New York. Was it last week or week before when we were there? But for me, it was quite striking to notice that I would say that G7 and European Union member states, we were discussing on Russia. But the rest of the world, they were discussing on fertilizers. And the main message was, when I met African leaders, I met 40 leaders in 3 days, was that you should lift the sanctions. You should lift the sanctions. You should lift the sanctions. And my fear is that if we now, had this kind of a vote in the UN like we had in the beginning of the war, we wouldn't get 141 countries to support us in terms of this resolution. And I think it also shows how active and good Russia is with its propaganda. And they are using the new technology in a way that we have no imagination for that. I just heard from one African leader that, he received a text message from Russia that, where they are explaining how this food insecurity and the food crisis is caused by our sanctions. So what we need to do is, of course, that we need to have a narrative, which we have. In terms of food security, we are doing lots. 7.7 billion euros is our support for the Global South. But I think we need to work more also as a team. And this is the whole concept of Team Europe, that we need to coordinate our actions not only in Brussels, but also on the ground in our partner countries, between the member states, but also the Commission, so that we have one common message, one common narrative, and we all stick to that, and everybody knows what the rest of us are doing. And this is something which Pekka and I, when we have been participating in the Foreign Affairs Council meetings, this has been very much discussed there as well, because we all recognize that challenge Russia is putting ahead of us.
Well, one of the problems might be that Europe is a little bit more difficult to understand from outside than we think it is. We think that we are normative power, but nobody else seems to care about that. Europe looks a very messy place. Now there's a large-scale war happening in Europe. So the signals that Europe is sending might be very much more negative, uninspiring than we would like them to be, even though for some reason we interpret those signals to be so nice and calming, and we put ourselves to a pedestal that perhaps we don't belong to. So should we kind of climb down from the high pedestal and talk about those basic needs of people? Fertilizers are better for many than highly minded values that we like to put out in our narratives.
Yeah, I think it was interesting to look at the surveys actually we have done in several African countries, and how well actually the African citizens recognize and acknowledge the support the EU is providing to those countries. And through those surveys, it was very clear that citizens in many African countries, they recognize China because the huge infrastructure projects China has funded and financed. They recognize in some countries also Russia. And then they recognize some European Union member states, like France, for instance, or then Portugal, depending, of course, also the countries, but not really the EU. Even though, I mean, as I explained, we are still the biggest trade partner, investor, and developing aid donor to those countries. So I think you have a right point there, that I think we have to be better in the communication, but I think we also have to be more in concrete. So that if we give a budget support to the government of, let's say, for instance, of Kenya, none of the citizens, they know about it and notice that. But if we do something concrete, like very often the infrastructure projects are, of course, it's more visible. It's more easy to recognize and acknowledge. So I think we have to think that what kind of projects and support we are giving, what kind of modalities we are using, but also how do we communicate on it.
Yes. One of the points of contradiction, and this question goes to Jutta and Pekka alike, has been the lofty words on certain topics like European defense and autonomy. Finland was a true believer in the European defense. We went around and we asked what 42.7 actually means. And then we applied to NATO. So how would you respond to that clear difference between the loftiness of the words and the actual practice, and Finland, the true believer, giving up on the hope when there's a desperate need currently?
Well, that's a good question. let me before answering that, let me reflect something that Jutta said about the European baggage, particularly in Africa and so forth. And I think it is a true issue that we still, the colonial past and all that history is with European Union, and we countries who didn't take part to such colonial activities, we are maybe overshadowed by some other events. I have been saying this earlier, but when I was the European Union Special Representative in Sudan and Darfur, I was sitting with the Sudanese minister, and he said that he's really missing the Cold War time. And I said, what was so good in the Cold War? And then he said that, well, we went to Washington, and if Washington didn't give enough money, we went to Moscow. So we put you to compete on your solidarity. And then when the Cold War disappeared, Russia left Africa, you left Africa, but luckily China stayed. And China has been staying. And I think in simplifying maybe the picture where we are now. Now we are coming back to Africa in many ways, but China has been working throughout all these years systematically. But maybe also, by the way, on the fertilizer issue, I see 4 points where this we have the culmination points of international community and the Russian attack on Ukraine. First is this voting on the borders is something that even those who have been otherwise staying quite neutral cannot buy. And I can see the Central Asian countries, we're really much afraid of this kind of concept. Even, when I'm talking to Belarus time to time, they are afraid of this kind of concept that Russia comes and puts a voting where the border goes and so forth. Second, of course, is this first use of the nuclear issue, which is now debated, if somebody really threatens with the nuclear or tactical nuclear weapons. Third is the normal nuclear safety issue with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and where actually United Nations and IAEA has been doing excellent work. And the fourth is the food crisis issue in many ways, where again UN and Guterres did a good job and with Turkey and to make this grain trade deal. And now I'm coming, Mika, to your question. What was the question?
42.7 and Finland giving up on the
Yes, it's the 42.7 issue. Of course, yes, we are true believers to 42.7. And then when the crisis came, actually the 42.7 came a little bit behind corner to meet us in the way that when we last spring, yes, we decided to apply NATO membership actually when we saw a crisis which will expand over those security limits that we could imagine in Europe. And I think it was very clear. People at the street stopped me and asked that if we are threatened by tactical nuclear weapons or if we are threatened by chemical weapons, how the Finnish military will respond and how the Finnish government will respond if we are going to wider conflict in Europe. And then, of course, we could analyze that there are many kinds of scenarios where we really need help, including, of course, cyber and hybrid threats and so forth. We have a strong national military, but we can imagine nowadays many scenarios that could exceed the capability of our national defense. And this was one of the key reasons to ally with those who have capabilities and with whom we could respond to this, even to unconventional threats. Then when we asked security guarantees for this, as we call the grey period, when we apply NATO membership, but we are not yet covered by Article 5. We got a very rapid response from the US, we got a very rapid response from UK, we are very grateful for this. And then we got rapid response for European countries who mainly said, hey, you are already covered by 42.7. Wow, this is good news, because 42.7 we have been lobbying, we have been advocating that there should be structure, how the 42.7 is organized, there should be exercises under the 42.7 European context. Of course, all this is missing. But basically, if countries think that 42.7 exists, that's good news for us and good news for everyone who is a member of European Union. But we still think that actually, since European Union is good at some part of the defense, when we think about the civil defense, when we think about the hybrid threats, when we think about the cyber threats, why don't we make more exercise? Why don't we make a structure for this kind of security as well in the European Union? We will be definitely in favor of that on Finnish side.
Pekka, perhaps a quick question is in order, what is the situation right now with the ratifications?
Well, in the ratification, I've been spending recently quite a lot of time with my Hungarian colleagues. I told that the Hungarian parliament did start at the 26th of September, the autumn process. We heard that Finland and Sweden, we are on the A list. There we also heard that some of the parties might cause a delay in the parliament for that, a couple of weeks delay, but basically nothing, from the government perspective in Hungary, nothing against the Finnish and Swedish membership. That was convinced to us when we visited there. On Turkey, I met my colleague Savusoglu several times now during the last weeks, also in Unga and then in Japan and so forth. We have been running this tripartite cooperation based on the memorandum that we did in Madrid in June. We had a first good tripartite meeting in August in Helsinki. Now we have had a bilateral expert meetings, actually just 2 days ago, one of those with Turks, and we are heading towards the tripartite meeting with Sweden, Finland and Turkey in October. We think that the process is going fine. We heard from Turkey that they were pleased with the Helsinki meeting and so forth. So those security concerns that Turkey has been, I think, properly addressed. But of course, the final decision will be made by Turkey. I have had 2 messages recently. I have said to Turkey that, well, it's not giving a very good image of Turkey and Finland if Turkey remains the only country who is not ratifying this, and there will be a delay. And secondly, when we have the mobilization in Russia, there has to be an understanding what this means to the security of Finland and Sweden, and what is the difference being inside or outside the Article 5. And this should be considered seriously also in those countries that have not yet ratified the agreement.
Thank you. Helga, quick question before we turn to the audience for more insightful questions. But how do you see the transformation of OSCE? Institutions always are transforming. So what results from Russia having this mentality of everlasting war, total mobilization under the guise of partial mobilization? What has to give in OSCE at some point if this goes on for multiple years?
Indeed, I mean, like every organization, also the OSCE is always trying to move forward. This is why internally, as Secretary General, I launched already last year the so-called functional review. That's internal. That's an effort, an ambition to make, in particular, the Secretariat more effective, to adjust processes, etc., because the organization is very much organically grown over the last year. So that's an ongoing process. The analysis is done. We're now in the implementation phase. Now, having said that, that's quite difficult at this point because, of course, the focus ever since the 24th of February has been very much on Ukraine. Just to give you one example, we had to evacuate more than 500 international monitors from the special monitoring mission from Ukraine, which was, thanks God, everyone came home safe, but this was a huge challenge which absorbed a lot of efforts, and I'm very, very grateful to my colleagues for really working day and night. I'm still very worried because I have 3 Ukrainian national staff members who are detained in the non-government controlled areas. 2 of them have been sentenced to 13 years. I'm mentioning all that because these are the issues that are very much on top of my mind, and I'm very grateful to Finland and all other participating states who have been supporting their release. But then when you talk about bigger reforms, you mentioned the Helsinki spirit, and I was here last year also, of course, with the minister, also with your president, who has been very much at the origins of that, and I fully supported that. And last year we had very good discussions inside the organizations in terms of where do we want to be in 2025, what's working, what's not working. Yes, we have consensus principle, which of course makes a decision. Takes time to come to decisions, and everyone really engaged in these discussions, and we also had We had some conclusions by the end of the year, but again, then the war started end of February, and the focus has been very much on that. Having said that, I very much believe that if you didn't have the OSCE, you would have to invent it, because you will need that forum. The UN is too big, so there is no other forum where you have everyone at the table, and that's why 2025 will be very important, the 50th anniversary, and of course we're looking very much forward to continuing the discussions.
We have been now focusing mostly on the state of Europe and not so much on the how the state affects Europe's success in the global competition, as the title puts it. Perhaps the audience can invent some questions regarding that as well. I can see 2 hands, so let's have those 3 hands, so those questions together. Perhaps let's start from there.
Thank you. Thank you. Jakob Hallgren, I'm director of the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I was impressed by the presentation of actions and measures that is done from the EU in terms of this global battle of narratives that was discussed. But it seems to me that there might be another litmus test, maybe as early as next week already. The UN ambassador said that she would bring the vote to the General Assembly after the discussion and the vote in the Security Council on Russia's referenda and annexation. So what do you think? Do you think it will happen? What will it lead to? And in case we don't get the 140 votes, what should we do in order to step up those measures more to convince the rest of the world of the morality of the issues that we've discussed throughout this conference? Thank you.
And
Jessica Berlin, GMF, and also relevant to this discussion, I'm also the vice chairman of a Pan-African fintech company. And so my question is coming from my context as a Africa-European partnership development consultant and advisor in my life, let's say before the Ukraine war. But one of the issues I'm actually working on with some Ukrainian colleagues is the problem of Russian disinformation and influence across the continent. I used to live in Rwanda, and I've done work with partners across over a dozen countries across the continent. And there's a real problem between the disconnect of what Europeans think Africans should think about us and how they should see our history and our evolved relationship, and how the Africans see it, said very broadly. You know, there's a lot of reason for African skepticism toward Western European and American overtures and lectures versus the very real historical and strategic ties they had with the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union, like it or not, were very frequently on the right side of history with some of the African liberation struggles from Western European colonial powers in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So this history is not that long ago. And so 2 points and 1 question. Point 1, firstly, the number one thing the EU could do would be not just to send aid, but to make better trade deals and offer better financing packages to African states. That is the number one thing they're asking for, and we don't give it to them. And so, of course, they have to go to the Chinese and the Russians, and increasingly the Gulf states, because we simply aren't offering finance on conditions that they can accept. Okay, and number 2, I think there's a huge opportunity, actually, for Eastern Europeans and for the former Eastern Bloc states that are now EU and NATO members to actually make a new coordinated diplomatic and interpersonal, even just building those networks with African diplomats, with African companies, because also a lot of African folks are not familiar with Eastern European post-colonial struggles. They don't understand the Soviet Union as and the Russian Federation as a colonial imperial power just as bad as the British Empire, the Belgians, or the Germans, or the French, etc. And so when I'm having conversations with African diplomats and business people, I'm always putting it in that frame, like, hey, imagine if the Brits showed up with the Navy off the coast of Accra and started bombing and saying, hey, you used to belong to us, we want you back. All of a sudden, they understand what we're talking about in Ukraine. But because the history is not there, the ties aren't there, the history of migration and the intercultural connections, I think we can start a whole new front of European African diplomacy by leading with our Eastern partners. And so my question would be, is there already work at the institutional level happening around that? And if not, how can I help make that happen?
Thank you. Charlie.
Thank you. I kind of feel like almost skipping the question after such a brilliant one. I was going to ask, Arkady in the previous panel talked about the end of the postmodern era, where we willingly let companies, private sector interests, create dependencies. Then I've heard about resilience building, food crisis, a water ownership crisis in many places. So my question is, how will we do two things? Both champion European companies, industries, enable European champions, restraining their negative behavior, for instance, regarding water ownership, etc., but also enabling them to compete against our adversary state companies, whether or not it's in telecom or something else. Kind of, we let everyone else compete, and, well, you know the rest of the story.
Well, thank you. Perhaps Jutta, if we start from you.
Yes, thanks a lot. Good, very good questions and comments. Regarding Africa, what we really have tried to do there is that in addition to this traditional development aid, we also want to encourage our companies to invest in Africa. And if you look at the outcome of the AU-EU summit, which was held in February, we launched Africa investment package in that summit. So one of the deliverable of the summit was this investment package up to 150 billion euros. So we really try to, like I said, work as a team. So Commission is putting its financial contribution. We are also receiving financial contributions from the member states. But then we also try to attract and encourage our private companies to invest in Africa through the European Investment Bank, through the national DFIs, and so forth. But what is new is that we have also tried to define and identify the policy priorities where we want to invest in. For instance, energy sector, transport, digital infrastructure. But in addition to that, also soft connectivity like health, education, and research. So this is a huge exercise which we started some time ago and which is still ongoing. And I want to thank Finland and the Foreign Ministry for your very active contribution, because I think Finland is maybe the only member state who has really nominated a specific person to be responsible for Global Gateway in your permanent representation for the EU. So I think it's very good that you are active, and we try to encourage also the other member states to be active in this exercise. Then what kind of conditions we have for our financial support? We have to remember that we are always, I'm talking about now as a commissioner, we are always operating with our taxpayers' money. I need to go to the European Parliament. I see some colleagues here from there. I need to be able to explain why we are financing a certain project in certain African countries. So from that perspective, I think it's very understandable that we also have some conditions for our budget support especially, but also some other financial modalities. And this is of course not the case with China, neither Russia, neither Gulf states. So their approach is very different. But I agree with you regarding trade. And this is something which is very much highlighted also from our African partners, and we are supporting them, definitely. And then, Charlie, I think your question regarding dependencies, I have a very good example to tell, because in the middle of the COVID, we learned that Africa imports 99% of the vaccines it uses. they really produce 1%. And it's very similar to other medicines as well. So what we did was that we created this Team Europe initiative, where we invited our member states, for instance, Germany, Belgium, some other member states, their companies, so European companies, to invest in Africa. So we actually work with 4 African countries: Senegal, Rwanda, South Africa, and Ghana. And the idea is really to start a COVID-19 vaccine production still this year, at least in 2 of those countries. And then later on, I hope that we can produce other vaccines as well and medicines. So how to, in a way, also support the autonomy of Africa and at the same time strengthen their own resilience. I think this is a very good example, which we now try to use also in terms of food security. And lastly, about the vote, I have to admit that I'm not fully informed whether the vote will take place. But what we try to do, of course, is that we try to reach out, engage with our partner countries globally. I'm responsible for 126 countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia. Explain our point of view. How do we see the war of Ukraine? It's not only about sovereignty, it's very much war about the UN Charter, about values, international cooperation, and so forth. But on the other hand, like some of you and also Pekka highlighted, we also have to understand their history and their arguments. And that's why I personally find it not very wise to think, like I have heard that some very prominent foreign policy actors have actually proposed that we should somehow punish those partner countries and our partners who don't really take sides in this war. For us, it's of course difficult to understand why they are not supporting us, for instance, in the vote. But on the other hand, they have their own arguments, their own history. And I think if we start to punish them by, for instance, decreasing our financial support to them, I think we are just pushing them to Russia and China. So this is my position, and I have been defending that also internally in the EU.
Helga. Yes.
Yeah. I would fully agree with Jutta, and I think the point that history is so important, but also the need to better explain, for example, the recent historic experience of Eastern Europeans is absolutely critical. And I worked in the European Union before, and I remember having exactly that discussion also with South Africa, for example. But I cannot speak for Europe anymore, but I just wanted to underline one point that also, and this is indeed the importance of trade. Now, we are a security organization, but we do not only try to cope with the security challenges, be it terrorism, be it extremism, etc. We also try to promote connectivity, and here Global Gateway is absolutely crucial. When I was working in the European Union, I was involved in the Origins. I'm very happy it's there now, the Global Gateway. We also promote connectivity in the OSCE. It's part of the second dimension, environmental/economic, and the link to security. Because how do you promote security? Also by promoting regional cooperation, and I was with the Foreign Minister of Uzbekistan. I was also in Anga last week, and we spoke about the work they do in Termez, the hub there for transport links, also relating to Afghanistan. This is absolutely crucial. And we try to water diplomacy, because this was mentioned. Water can be a source of conflict, has been many times in history, but can also be a source for cooperation. This is something we are promoting, also by capacity building, training. But then and this will be my last point, is how do you engage the private sector, more business? And of course, business go where their interest lies. And I cannot speak for Africa, it's not part of the OSCE, but Central Asia, for example. And I remember having had many discussions with Central Asians who are very eager to have more European investment. But one issue is that you have to create the necessary conditions. So here, also in the OSCE, we work a lot to promote, help the states with their socio-economic reforms. Anti-corruption is very important. We have very good anti-corruption programs where we work with governments, because I think this is indeed absolutely crucial and goes hand in hand with the work we do to fight security threats and challenges.
May I very quickly comment on Central Asia, because this is something which unites me and Helga. So I just wanted to highlight that actually we are organizing now this connectivity forum in Central Asia. And through the Global Gateway, we have identified very concrete projects which we are going to finance and start in Central Asia. And I fully agree with you, Helga, that this is an area which is very important for us. But on the other hand, there is a lot of appetite. So they are very much willing to cooperate with the EU. And that's why we also encourage our member states to be more active in the Central Asia in general.
No, and if I may add just one point, indeed the OSCE will be part of that conference. But one point, I think indeed there is a need to give more visibility, but also because everyone knows the Belt and Road Initiative, but everyone also knows the downsides with countries being indebted, etc. And I think it's important to stress more the added value, for example, Global Gateway brings, because this is not about extraction of natural resources. This is about really promoting investment in a sustainable manner, promoting green energy, etc. But it's not known enough. So here again, visibility is absolutely crucial. Or more visibility is absolutely crucial.
I'm really happy that you highlighted that. I don't think that Belt and Road Initiative has led to those goals that China actually put to the program. They have spent so many billions of euros on it, and much of that money has just disappeared. Perhaps that rings a bell with Pekka's earlier comment on Soviet and Americans going to Africa and countries eager to take the money. China perhaps is a victim of that as well. So the European programs, they have to be designed with a different set of goals in mind, in competition with China. But Pekka?
Maybe on this China issue, if looking at the Chinese narrative in Africa, I have been sometimes following when Chinese representatives are speaking to African politicians, they might say that, look, the West was first skeptical that we couldn't cope with the overpopulation during the 70s, and we did it. Then the West was concerned that we couldn't cope with the economic challenges in China, and we did it. Then they said that we cannot cope with the environmental challenges, and now we are doing that with the Chinese solar panels and so forth. So the West has been wrong in all its claims. And actually it's an interesting issue. How do we counter-argue that? I think they have some points which are also true. But I will start with Charlie's comment. Actually, we have been advocating for the global economy for a long time, and now we see an anti-globalization ongoing, but in other meaning that the anti-global movements. We actually see the internet that is now divided into Chinese internet and soon to the Russian internet and then to the Western internet. And we see the energy production that we don't want to be too dependent on fossil fuels from Russia, and we actually are quite concerned about the Chinese role in the technology and so forth. And then we start to look for the like-minded groupings and so forth. But we had never been planning our economy in that way. We have always been planning it as a global economy, and now we are facing a major challenge, how to build an economy of like-minded, at least on some of those critical issues, whether it's vaccines or protection materials or energy or others. And at the same time, we are facing questions like Volkswagen asking should they leave Germany because of the lack of the energy and others. So we are really in our economic system facing a major challenges as we understand. Then maybe just to comment on UN processes and let's see how this goes with the General Assembly, the Ukraine issue. But I think we have to come with our partners, including the African partners, always back to the very basic issues. There is a UN Charter, Article 51. you have the right to defend your country. Secondly, you have the right to ask others to help you in that defense. And thirdly, this can be done also before the issue is solved by the UN Security Council. So there is a path how the issue should be solved by the Security Council, and now we have a Security Council that is frozen on this issue. Veto is used, so at least the first part you can defend, and you can ask some others to help you in that. Defending your country is true. I remember actually one of the most dramatic moments in my parliamentary life was when the Kuwaiti delegation came to Finland and said that based on Article 51, Iraq has occupied Kuwait. Can Finland help? And it was quite a moment when country almost disappearing and then asking help from others. And I think we should stick. That's an important principle for everyone. Then on maybe just final comment on this different how to convince Africans and others. We really have had actually already many years this Nordic Africa ministerial meetings exactly for the reason that, for example, the Nordic countries have another kind of history and with African countries and can explain from another perspective what is Europe about and so forth. But I think you put a really right question that the baggage is there.
Yes, thank you. We have time still for another round of questions from the audience. Do I see any hands up? If I don't, then I will continue because one of the countries that I find very relevant that was on the list of those countries who abstained from voting is India. And when we are talking about what is Europe as an actor, is it a teamwork, team competition where we partner with US that is very clear that we cannot cope without the US. US is the largest contributor militarily to Ukraine. Currently has saved us from 2 world wars during the past century. So what is the place of India? How come when I talk with Indian diplomats, they feel a bit left out from a group of democratic countries or like-minded countries? So they find it difficult to relate to us, and that might be one of the pieces of the puzzle why India is taking an independent-minded route to Ukraine. How would you see India when it comes to European Union, when it comes to Finland and also OSCE, when we talk about Greater Central Asia, for example?
Well, if I start, we had a very good bilateral meeting with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and of course he has recently been visiting Finland, and I have been to India and also the Prime Minister Modi's visit to Copenhagen when he met with the Nordic prime ministers. It was very important. So we have been advancing in the India relationship also bilaterally, but also on the European Union level. I think there's more and more direct cooperation with India. Of course, the issue of their own region, the dynamics, particularly with China, is something that dominates the picture. Not to speak about the Pakistan-India relations, and when Helga mentioned Afghanistan, actually it's interesting when you open that battle with Indians. They have a lot of knowledge on Afghanistan. They have a lot of views how the issues should be handled and solved and so forth. So we have many common issues, including the security concerns and including the radical movements and terrorism and so forth. And I think there's a lot of common ground. But to get India on board on the group of the democratic countries with a clear answer to the situation in Ukraine and so forth, of course, is a challenge. I understand that there has been arms trade from Russia to India and that kind of interest, which are also there, which has been maybe influencing to their views of the situation. But I think when looking at the Samarkand meeting and both the Chinese India, and I would say the public reactions towards President Putin, I think we can read between the lines and even from the lines something that is that shows that the further this war goes and the more it's affecting also to the economic development, it's a bigger and bigger concern actually both for China and for India, because it's ruining their economic plans and the benefits that their governments have been thinking to give to their population, I think the major economic implications is probably the one reason that could then trigger even stronger reaction both in China and India towards what Russia is doing.
It's interesting. I was talking with the former Indian foreign minister last year, and he noted that he finds it puzzling that India is actually fighting a war against China up in the Himalayas. There's a low intensity warfare going on, and they were missing a Western response to that. There was no solidarity towards India. So our dependencies on China are influencing the strategic competition in a difficult way for us. Jutta, perhaps you go next.
Well, I also have a good cooperation with the Foreign Minister of India and had several bilateral meetings with him, and maybe three very brief points. First, I think my personal assessment is that India's identity is very much democratic country. They say that they are the world's biggest democracy, which they definitely are. But on the other hand, when it comes to Ukraine, I think, at least what I have heard from their side, is that they don't want to take sides. They see themselves as a kind of superpower, which doesn't want to take side between the West and the Russia. So like this angle. Then, which I find interesting, is that they are very much reinforcing their presence in Africa. They have opened several new embassies in different countries, and they would really like to also cooperate with us, with the EU in Africa. So they would like to have, joint projects and so forth. And then where we really work with them at the moment is in energy sector. So we have this project under the G7 umbrella, Just Energy Transition Initiative, where India is active. We also work with them on digital. And then we have specific countries like Afghanistan, which was highlighted by Helga, and I fully agree with you that we should pay more attention to that country. So with India, for instance, we have a close cooperation in terms of Afghanistan. So we have a specific countries, then we have certain policy areas, and geographically they want to work with us more in Africa. But you can see that I think that their identity is a kind of a superpower. So they also have their conditions for the cooperation. So we have to acknowledge that if we want to work with them, which we definitely want to do. But for me, it's very unlikely to see them really take sides. Of course, I mean, the Modi speech was very powerful, but that they would really, take positions, for instance, in the UN, regarding Ukraine, I doubt, but I hope that I'm wrong.
Yes, Helga, you will have the last comment, a chance for a comment of this year's Helsinki Security Forum. So we are really expecting great words from you. You can pick up the Indian question or then answer a question of your own.
Maybe just quickly then on India, I fully agree. I think India is not a participating state or not a partner for cooperation, because we have Asian partners for cooperation, but that's Japan, that's Australia, South Korea, Thailand, and also Afghanistan. But I've worked closely with India before when I worked in the European Union, and of course they see it from the broader geopolitical standpoint, and if as a consequence of the war there's a closer cooperation cooperation between China and Russia. That is not viewed in India always with a lot of good feelings, also precisely, and you're referring to that also because some of the issues they have with China. And then there's the quest for energy. This goes for China, this goes for India, so these are very clear interests they have. But I think one point, and then I'll be my final comment then, I think that I remember also from previous discussions, because India, and Jutta, you're absolutely right, they see themselves as the world's largest democracy, and they believe in a rules-based order and in multilateralism. And I think this is the point, is that we do not want to have a kind of Westphalian order to come back. What do I mean by that? That you have great powers surrounded by client states, and then the great powers impose their will and their decisions on the client states. That's not cooperative security. This is called deterrence-based security, and this can lead to escalation and even further escalation. So this is why I think the task is really to try everything and to explain maybe even better to countries outside the European Union and out there that we need to come back to a rules-based order, also based on our three dimensions in the OSCE, which is political, military, environmental, economic, and the very important human dimension with fundamental rights. I think that's the only way, and this is also this is how I see my task also for the OSCE and for Finland as a very important participating state, to make sure indeed that we preserve the OSCE as a forum where hopefully sooner than later we can have meaningful talks again on how to do better on cooperative security. Final last word. And absolutely on time.
Thank you very much. I know that you are busy and you have engagements elsewhere. So I would like to thank you on behalf of the Helsinki Security Forum on taking part. Good discussion, and it is discussion that it will be ongoing. So thank you very much.